The cottonwoods were burning in their full autumn glory, soft afternoon sunlight shimmering through their trembling leaves. The Yellowstone flowed swiftly and noisily over its pebbly bed, the longest free-flowing river in the lower 48 states. In the 60s, there wasn't a ranch in this country from Bismarck to Bozeman and from the Platte River to Canada. It was a land considered fit only to raise Indians, and while some of the whites were hoping for a crop failure in that department, the majority were indifferent. They couldn't care how much the tribes fought amongst themselves. They were like the old-timer whose wife was battling a grizzly bear. He said that he had never seen a fight where he took so little interest in the outcome. That, in a bit more than a nutshell, was how people felt about this rolling country and its inhabitants in the mid-19th century. They viewed it as a wasteland, something to be crossed as quickly as possible on the way to the comfort and riches of the far west. But to the Indians, especially the Crow, whose home it was, the land was sacred and beautiful, an earthly paradise. Here are the words of Arapahoe-ish, a Crow chief in Washington Irving's The Adventures of Captain Bonneville. Quote, "The Crow country is a good country. The Great Spirit has put it exactly in the right place. While you are in it, you fare well. Whenever you go out of it, whichever way you travel, you fare worse." Unquote. Although the region was traditionally Crow, the other Indians, notably the Sioux and Cheyenne, invaded it, driven by the pressure of tribes behind them to the east and lured by the plentiful horses of their neighbors ahead. It was generally acknowledged that this was the Indians' last best hunting ground. A treaty, signed at Fort Laramie in 1851, guaranteed Indian rights in a large area that included much of the present state of Wyoming and Montana. Although the treaty also specified the right of the United States to, quote, "establish roads, military, and other posts," unquote, many of the Indians apparently thought the treaty meant the white people would stay out altogether. For a decade they did, but after gold was discovered in southwestern Montana in 1862, a white man proposed to run wagon trains through this land from the Oregon Trail to the northern mountains. The consequences, as the shrewder of the Indians well knew, would be disastrous. Everywhere else on the plains, the coming of the whites had meant the disappearance of the buffalo herds, in which the Indians depended. The threat to these last herds was intolerable. So when John Bozeman, a gentleman adventurer from Georgia, rode through in 1863 looking for a suitable wagon route, he barely escaped with his life. Subsequently, after a road was established against the Indians' wishes, and the government sought to keep it open by force, a mean, cruel struggle resulted that dominated the early history of the trail. The Bozeman's heyday lasted from 1864 to 1868, when the westward progress of the Union Pacific Railroad provided a faster way to the goldfields. Nor did large numbers of settlers ever travel on the trail. Still, its story is rich and eventful. Some of the Indians' last victories against the white incursions took place here, and on the Bozeman were planted the seeds of the Indians' ultimate defeat. Bozeman was a stalwart fellow. He left his family in Georgia and came west with the idea of mining gold. He was quite young, only about 25 years old. He certainly didn't find mining to his satisfaction, digging down to the bedrock, up to his neck in ice water, shoveling gravel by the ton. So he conceived the idea of scouting a trail and guiding in emigrants. Bozeman was enamored with this valley and its agricultural potential. He and his associates laid out a town, hoping to attract people to whom they could sell land. He was an active man, constantly on the move. He induced some people to set up a flour mill in the town. He was working to establish a toll road and a ferry on the Yellowstone. He did some farming north of Main Street, and he had an interest in a little hotel. Bozeman came to be regarded as the spokesman for Montana. John Bozeman envisioned a great migration into the Gallatin Valley, and in the spring of 1863, he left on horseback to lay out a route for the expected rush of wagon trains from the east. With him were John M. Jacobs, a veteran mountainman, and Jacobs' 11-year-old daughter by his Flathead Indian wife. Near the mouth of the Bighorn River, they were intercepted by a band of Crow Indians. Although generally tolerant towards the whites, the Crows seldom passed up a chance to steal horses or rob lonely travelers who couldn't put up a fight. Accordingly, they took the trio's horses and most of their other belongings. For good measure, they beat Jacob's Indian daughter with a ramrod for being in the company of white men. Near starvation, the three eventually reached help. and Bozeman went on eastward to recruit customers for his route to the Montana gold fields. By July 1st, he had assembled a train on the North Platte River. It was made up of 45 wagons, mostly ox-drawn, and 90 men prepared to shoot 425 rounds without reloading, according to the collections of James Kirkpatrick, one of the travelers. On July 20th, when the train stopped at noon near the Bighorns, a band of Sioux and Cheyennes appeared on the ridge. Spokesmen approached and told the emigrants to turn back. If they did, they would be left unharmed. If they did not, they would be killed. Bozeman advised his companions to keep going. After all, there were 90 of them, and they were all well armed. But the majority decided to turn around. Determined, Bozeman and several others left the wagon train and went on to Virginia City, riding their horses at night and lying low in the daytime to avoid Indians. In January of 1864, John Bozeman, undaunted by his initial failure, was leaving Virginia City to organize another party of emigrants. This time the journey was successful, and Bozeman's wagon train arrived in the Gallatin Valley the following August. From then on, emigrant and freight trains used the trails with increasing regularity. Just as regularly, Indians attacked the travelers, running off the livestock, stealing horses, ambushing stragglers, and scalping their victims. The hostilities were not limited to the Bozeman Trail, but included attacks elsewhere on the northern plains against railroad construction crews who had been working their way from the east and on telegraph lines and mail routes. Through 1864 and 1865, attempts to deal with the Indians by force of arms were notably unsuccessful. But peace negotiations failed too, because, though the whites did not seem to understand this, the Indians had no formally designated leaders with authority to negotiate binding agreements. The Bozeman Trail, at least in the rugged country occupied by the Sioux, continued to be a combat zone. An account by Perry A. Burgess of a trip over the trail in 1866 includes these entries. August 3rd. Passed the place where the French trader and 4 others were murdered a short time ago by the Indians. August 4th. A wagon had been captured by the Indians, plundered, and destroyed. August 7th. Where we nooned today, we saw where a man that was killed by Indians out of a train a few days ahead of us had been buried. August 11th. Tried to find a place to ford the Bighorn River in vain. Found graves of men that had been killed by Indians. In 1866, the federal government decided to establish a line of forts along the Bozeman Trail. This would answer a great public clamor, especially from Montana residents, demanding protection for travelers. The military units would also, it was hoped, distract hostile Indians from the construction crews working on the advancing Union Pacific Railroad, in which the government had a heavy investment. Colonel Henry B. Carrington, a desk soldier whose 18th Infantry had fought with distinction, but without him in the Civil War, was assigned to build and garrison the forts. Carrington and more than 700 troops arrived at Fort Laramie just as government negotiators were trying to persuade the famed Red Cloud and other Sioux leaders to permit travel through their country. When Red Cloud saw Carrington and learned of his mission, he became indignant. Pointing at the colonel, he shouted, "You are White Eagle, who has come to steal the road. The Great Father sends us presents and wants us to sell him the road. But the white chief comes with soldiers to steal it before the Indians say yes or no. I will talk no more." Some of us called this good logic, wrote Mrs. Margaret Carrington in her book about the frontier life, Absaroka, Home of the Crows. The comment may seem surprising coming from the wife of an army commander about to engage the enemy, but it illustrates the perplexity and division that existed nationwide over the treatment of the Indians on the frontier. Many people had been horrified by such actions as the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, when nearly 200 Indians had been slaughtered by the 3rd Colorado Volunteers, a militia regiment. Pro-Indian sentiment was strongest in the East and had support of powerful liberal politicians and much of the press. Among most Westerners and many of the military who were directly involved, the feelings were quite different. There were hawks and doves in those days too. Mrs. Carrington at least perceived 2 sides to the question. Before leaving for the Powder River country, east of the Bighorns, Colonel Carrington wrote the first of many letters pleading for more supplies and more reinforcements. He was particularly concerned about the shortages of ammunition. Nevertheless, the next few months were a period of intense activity. Carrington relieved the garrison at Fort Reno, a small post established on the Powder River the previous year. then moved on to the green eastern flank of the Bighorns, where he constructed Fort Philip Kearny, south of present-day Sheridan, Wyoming. Later, he was to send 2 companies 90 miles further north, where the Bighorn River comes out of the mountains, to build Fort C. F. Smith, probably the most isolated army post of the time. While the soldiers labored on Fort Phil Kearny, with its massive stockade of logs from the pine-wooded slopes of the mountains, the Indians almost daily attacked one or another of the work details that ventured away from the post. Alarms were constant, Mrs. Carrington wrote. The ladies all came to the conclusion, no less than the officers affirmed it, that the Laramie Treaty was wa-neshe, no good. In October of 1866, an exceptional and determined man named Nelson Story passed through the Bighorn country with a herd of Texas Longhorn cattle. In doing so, he added another chapter to the accumulating lore of the Bozeman Trail. Like so many others, Nelson Story went to Montana looking for gold. After 3 years' work, he had accumulated about $40,000 worth. A businessman, not a gambler, Story knew when to quit. He went to New York City, where he converted the gold dust into greenbacks, most of which he deposited in a bank. Sewing $10,000 in cash into the lining of his overcoat, he traveled on to Texas, where he bought 1,000 head of cattle. With several helpers, he drove his herd north to Wyoming. They picked up the Bozeman Trail, and when they reached Fort Phil Kearny, Carrington told Story, quote, "You can't go on up there. Those Indians will kill you," unquote. He made Nelson stop, but he wouldn't let him bring cattle close to the fort. He wanted to save the grass there for his horses. So there was Nelson, camped 3 miles away, and he could just smell some kind of trouble. He and the others powwowed and agreed that they'd better get out of there. They left that night. Nelson Story got the cattle through and established the first cattle grazing operation on the Yellowstone. Though the original cattle were longhorns, leggy animals with a lot of daylight under them, good beef were imported to improve the herd. The family's ranching enterprise continues to this day. Nelson Story became one of Bozeman's leading citizens, and among his associates was John Bozeman. When Bozeman was killed in a small grassy canyon near the Yellowstone in 1867, presumably by Blackfoot Indians, Nelson Story provided the monument that marks his grave in the cemetery on the hill above the town. Aside from its epic quality, Story's cattle drive was remarkable in that it was actually so uneventful. There were apparently only 2 minor skirmishes with the Indians, but back in the Bighorn country that Story had passed through, tragedy was brewing. Now in their winter encampments, with plenty of buffalo jerky to see them through the bad weather, the Indians began planning their trouble for Carrington and his troops, and the colonel, intent on completing his defenses, was being ordered to take the offensive. When he did strike out at the raiders in the hills, he exposed the vulnerability of his soldiers, poorly trained to combat guerrilla tactics. On December 6, 1866, Carrington just managed to escape an Indian ambush when he led troops out of Fort Phil Kearny to relieve a beleaguered woodcutting party. One of his officers and a veteran sergeant were killed. From the 16th to the 19th, he wrote, Indians appeared almost daily about the wood party, or within sight of the fort. On December 21st, the wood party again came under attack, and Carrington ordered his troops out in force, 78 officers and men under Captain William J. Fetterman. They were joined by 2 civilians and Captain Frederick H. Brown, who had orders to report to Fort Laramie, but volunteered to follow Fetterman, hoping to see some action and perhaps get an Indian scalp for himself. Before Fetterman left the fort, Carrington explicitly forbade him to extend any pursuit of the Indians beyond a line of hills known as Lodge Trail Ridge. That was where Carrington had nearly been killed earlier in the month. Fetterman, however, a decorated and battle-hardened soldier of the Civil War, perhaps felt that he could improvise to his current situation atop the ridge. Defying the colonel's orders, he promptly led his contingent towards some Sioux decoys, and beyond the fateful ridge, where perhaps 3,000 Indians lay in wait. The scene of action told its own story. Carrington wrote in his official report, "The road on the little ridge, where the final stand took place, was strewn with arrows, arrowheads, scalp poles, and broken shafts of spears. The arrows that were spent harmlessly from all different directions show that the command was suddenly surrounded. Most of the bodies were horribly mutilated. Fetterman and Brown had each a revolver shot in the left temple, as Brown had always declared that he would reserve a shot for himself as a last resort. so I am convinced that these two brave men fell by the other's hands rather than undergo slow torture. It was the worst defeat yet suffered by the U.S. Army troops at the hands of the Indians in the West. Not until George A. Custer's battle at the Little Bighorn in 1876 did a greater tragedy occur, a tragedy itself rooted in the conflicts of the early Bozeman Trail days. Colonel Carrington was transferred in near disgrace, though the disaster was hardly his fault. Ironically, Forts Phil Kearny and C.F. Smith were soon reinforced and their troops equipped with new breech-loading rifles in place of the old muzzle-loaders, as Carrington had been requesting all along. Emboldened, the Indians continued their raiding until 1867. That year they launched two more major assaults, one at Fort C.F. Smith and the second at Fort Phil Kearny. Although the Indians came in force, they were repelled each time by a relatively small number of well-armed soldiers and civilians. Still, the harassment was putting a strain on the U.S. Treasury resources, still depleted in the aftermath of the Civil War. One cost accountant of the day, with the grisly arithmetic of war, calculated that it cost the Army $200,000 to kill an Indian. And for what? For the Bozeman Trail? As General Sherman wrote, quote, "That road and the posts along it had been constructed for the benefit of the people of Montana, but had almost ceased to be of any practical use to them by reason of the building of the Union Pacific Railroad." Unquote. And so it happened to the Bozeman, as it did to all the other great western trails. The railroads rendered them of little or no use, or changed their purpose. In 1868, the posts along the Bozeman were abandoned. Fort C.F. Smith's adobe walls were left to crumble away. Fort Phil Kearny was burned down by the Indians. Fort Reno also burned, probably engulfed in a prairie fire. For the time being, at least, the Indians controlled their last best hunting ground, and the last trail west faded into history.